Welcome to the Genealogy Radio Show, the radio show that's keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is all about Limerick City, its origins, the sources, and some of the things that make it the great city that it is. So we've got a lot of information on it, and it's a fascinating history for one of the oldest cities to have local community government and a mayor and so on. But it goes back even further than that with Viking Limerick. So the Vikings founded Limerick in around 922 AD. According to the local sources on this and local blogs, and some very good ones, I might add, Tim Lambert has written very well on it. It was an obvious place, quote, to build a town because it was an island between the Shannon and the Abbey River. So there's two water sources servicing it as such. And Shannon, of course, is an estuary that goes out into the sea, and it was easily defended. It became a very thriving town. But when you're looking at the origins for the Vikings, sometimes it's the place names in Limerick that give you the clue as to what they would have used it for. So the Vikings would have fought each other as well as the Irish, and the term actually, like a long fort in bits and pieces as they would have settled, translates as a ship camp. So the most traditional of a long fort by historians would be a temporary base used primarily for raiding. This definition probably could be oversimplistic, and Kathy Swift writes on it as well. But some of the sources that you get: Hugh, son of Niall, plundered all the strongholds, long forts of the foreigners, that is in the territory of the north, both in Kilnoan and Dal Aradi, and took away their heads, their flocks, and their herds from camp by battle. A victory was gained over them at Lochfoyle, and 12 score heads taken thereby. So 12 score heads, quite significant here. That's 120. So the Annals of the Kingdoms of Ireland by the Four Masters, more commonly known as the Annals of the Four Masters, also provides valuable sources. But it's not a contemporary source like the Annals of Ulster and the Chronicum Scotorum. The Four Masters relied on sources that we still have today, like the two already mentioned. Kathy Swift interestingly talks about the name Athlunkard, which is a place in Limerick, and that having the element of long fort, which originated as a term describing the defensible location for ships, which evolved into a word used in Irish to describe fortifications. So it's really interesting to see that the name showing the place for Viking sources survives. In genealogy, of course, we have the surnames, which are later than this, maybe 300 years later than this. So if we can trust what we have the Vikings operating in the mid-10th century of Limerick, and they were families who could operate between Ireland and Britain as well as across Ireland, and they also appeared to have been dynasties as well, claiming ancestry from those active in the same region in the 9th century. So Limerick Vikings appear in sources as mercenaries, also available for hire by Munster kings, and there appears to have been at least 2 Viking dynasties operating out of Limerick, which allied itself to the Oganacht and also against the second with the Dalgate. So the use of mercenaries begins really to be a feature of Irish battle as such then, because gallogly are used and galloglass are used later on. After the Dalgash conquest of Limerick, the dynasty seems to have been active on the east coast of the Irish Sea. So you get movement of dynasties of Vikings from Limerick moving around the country and so on. In 968, the Irish captured Limerick. The following year, the Vikings recaptured Limerick. In the 11th century, the Irish again captured Limerick. So gradually the Vikings were absorbed into Irish society. Inside Limerick, there were the same craftsmen found in any Viking town, such as blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, and men who made things. And life went on as such while they went off raiding, and then they became fixed and settled in points, and that's how the Vikings operated. But there are many accounts of them attacking religious sites in Ireland because, of course, their religion would not have been following St. Patrick or Christianity and so on. So you're looking at two things going on. Now, in 1194, you have a new thing happening in Ireland. And what you really have is very much like the conquest. And the English captured Limerick as such, which is really important. And it's the same year in 1194 that St. Mary's Cathedral was completed. In 1197, and we have a lot of great work done by Matthew Potter, Limerick was given a charter, a document granting townspeople certain rights. In between the decade of 1200 and 1210, King John's Castle was built, and Thomond Bridge was also built. Many English settlers came to Limerick. They settled on King's Island in Englishtown, while the native Irish were moved across the Abbey River to Irishtown. I wasn't aware that the stone wall wasn't always there, and it's funny what we have fixed in our minds. So in the 13th century, a stone wall was erected around Englishtown, and later they extended around Irishtown. And of course, we have famous dances, the walls of Limerick, and so on, showing it to be a prosperous town. Farm produce was exported, wine was imported from France and Spain, and there was a nunnery founded in 1171. And of course, you had the usual things of the friars and everything that's reflecting the growth of an urban centre and a thriving urban centre. I hadn't been aware before the show research that the Scots attempted to conquer Ireland. I knew that, but I didn't realise that King Robert the Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, had captured Limerick in 1316. It was very short-lived, only 2 years. In 1318, the Scots were defeated and Edward was killed. So it's interesting to think of Robert the Bruce brother and that having an impact in that part of Ireland. So Limerick in the 16th and 17th century, it is a very busy place. In the 17th century, though, we have a very turbulent one for Limerick because Limerick underwent 4 sieges. Ireland rose in rebellion in 1641, and we've some great sources for that in genealogy with the depositions list available on the Trinity College Ireland website. So you can, if you were to type in Limerick, then you would get plenty of names of people who were dispossessed of their property, and it might give you good clues for 17th century sources for Irish family history. In 1642, the Irish army came into Limerick and the English troops withdrew into the castle in King John's Castle. It was sieged. The English held out for over a month, but they gave in when they realised the Irish were mining the walls. A common tactic for this was to make the walls collapse by tunnelling underneath them, and then the weight of the walls would cause it to collapse. Oliver Cromwell began coming to Ireland. We didn't come to Ireland actually, but the conquest began in 1649, and in 1651, under Henry Ireton, he arrived in Limerick. They had to blockade Limerick. A plague broke out and it decimated the defenders. And after 5 months, the Irish under their leader, Hugh O'Neill, had to surrender. Many were executed. Some were allowed to leave if they promised they'd never come back again. So you get some influence of the wild geese. And we're going to have Helena talking about that in a minute or two. And we have the next siege of Limerick taking place in 1690. So there was 4 sieges, which is important to remember. And that's about the Stuart dynasty, the deposition of the Stuart deposition being deposed in James II reign. So the Irish supported the Stuart line, but they were defeated at the Battle of the Boyne. So William of Orange, the new English king, arrived in August, and there was a battle then with Patrick Sarsfield. And of course, Sarsfield is a really famous name around Limerick, and we have a great deal of Dutch influence in Limerick as a result of all this type of things that are happening during the war, because you end up with palaces being built for the Protestant bishops of Limerick and so on. So Helena, would you like to say anything about some of the landmarks you know about Limerick?
Sure, thanks, Lorna. So Sarsfield had a more personal influence than any man in Ireland, and was indeed a gentleman of eminent merit, bravery, upright, honourable, and careful of his men in quarters, and certain to always be at the head in the day of the battle. His intrepidity, his frankness, his boundless good nature and stature, which far exceeded that of the ordinary man, and the strength which he had exerted in personal conflict, gained him the affectionate admiration of the populace. Patrick Sarsfield's monument was erected in 1881, and the bronze figure stands pointing in the 17th century costume with a sword pointing towards Balneedy. In preparation for Limerick Bastiles Day, the Wild Geese Festival, Garryowen Residents Association made a unique contribution by renovating the Sarsfield Monument in the Cathedral Place. Last year, in July in 2021, it was the 330th anniversary of the departure of the Irish Jacobite Army under the command of General Patrick Sarsfield from Ireland to France, which became known as the Flight from the Wild Geese. According to the Garryowen Residents Association members, the Sarsfield Monument is important to the people of Garryowen as the treaty stone to the people of Tomagate. The restoration project was a partnership between local community activists and local business owners. The event that led to the signing of the Treaty of Limerick were the assault of Johnsgate, the resistance of the fabled women of Limerick, and the defeat of the Williamite army, which all happened within the perimeter of Garryowen. Local people have a special affinity with the Sarsfield Monument, which has been a meeting point for generations in the St. John's parish. It not only represents the hero himself, but also an event that resonated across Europe. It is immense in history, which lives in the old city walls, the cathedral, the medieval graveyard, the architecture of St. John's Square, and all the historical events that took place there. During the festival, His Excellence, the French ambassador, visited the area as part of the celebrations. The Limerick Bastille Day Wild Geese Festival is organised by the Limerick Civic Trust and the Consular Agency of the France in the Midwest, with the support of Limerick City Council.
That's fantastic, Helena. Thank you very much for that. It's really nice to see that the flavour on the ground with the place names and so on is really kept alive there, you know, so very lovely stuff. And what I'm looking at now is the 18th century records and 19th century records derived from Tracing Your Limerick Ancestors by Margaret Franklin, a wonderful publication printed by Flyleaf Press. And she draws attention to the 1793-1794 Catholic qualification rolls. There was an act allowing Catholics to hold certain leases provided they had taken and subscribed the oath of allegiance passed in the Irish Parliament in 1774. So this includes names, addresses, and rank and occupation of Catholics taking the oath. This is a really valuable source for us doing genealogy in the 18th century. There's also the flax growers list. So there are flax growers' names for 18 Limerick parishes. And prisoners, 1798 prisoners in Limerick jail. There's a source for this dating from 1966. 1797 to 1846, the Limerick County Militia, the names, lengths in service and reasons for discharge. And also the 1809 and 1821, the game licenses, a list of names and addresses of Limerick persons who have taken out licenses for killing of game. And that's actually in the Irish Ancestor, volume 16, 1984 edition. So it's a really valuable edition for that. In 1811, in the 19th century, early 19th century, with the to 1833, you have the Thalsel court records, the names of plaintiffs, defendants, attorneys, judges, and judgments, and also an index. And that's available on the Limerick City archive in the digital archives. Limerick City have a wonderful local studies section available online. So this is well worth our listeners to look out for if they've got ancestry from Limerick City, or to even find their aspects. In 1813, there's a wonderful inhabitants of St. Mary's and St. John's Parish, and you have the chief inhabitants of the parishes, and that's in the Irish Ancestor in a 1985 issue. So really useful to have that. 1816 to 1828, the freeholders of Limerick. Freeholders would have been able to make votes and stuff and so on, and that's in the genealogical office in a manuscript. So it's well serviced, you know, by wonderful records where you might not be able to find them anywhere else. And it's got very early baptismal records as well. So some other unusual things to note, we did a medical project some years ago, the co-op students from UL, and we noticed the cholera epidemic. So there are the cholera papers from 1832 to 1834. When cholera broke out in the late 1820s, early 1830s, in June, they slaked Limerick City with lime, so much so that, as contemporary sources noted, it looked like a December day with the snow on the ground, because that was the only resource that they had. Limerick City, I would say, probably has the most powerful legacy for medicine and for that, and for it really has some astounding developments, where the IV was invented by William Shaughnessy, and he was a Limerick man. And it came about as a response to cholera, because cholera, of course, dehydrates you, and that is how it largely leads to death. So Limerick has a fascinating history and is a fascinating city even today, and one to be proud of with its many resources and its long antiquity. So once a fortress, once a place for a ship's port for the Vikings, the walls and the gates were locked at night. In 1760, the status at Limerick were changed, and most of the medieval walls were pulled down. So those walls were actually there until the late 18th century. It underwent a new suburb being built called Newtown Perry, and you have Edmund Sexton Perry, who was responsible for building that part. And you have the Custom House being built in 1769. Many new buildings in the 19th century, strong medical, Barrington's Hospital, medical centres and bits and pieces, and some terrible poverty in Limerick in the 19th century. Fascinating literature sources with Frank McCourt and so on. And in 1901, Limerick had a population of 38,000, and it did remain a very strong agricultural town. The main industry was food processing, and of course, wonderful hams and so on, which went all over the world, and technology, and had bought the manufacture of clothing and garment. And Limerick made the uniforms for both sides, I believe, for the American Civil War. So very useful to be able to see that. So we have a lovely show today on Limerick City, and I want to thank Helena, who joined and told us about the fascinating projects in Limerick. So thank you very much, Helena. The show is podcast out every week, and it also gets repeated on a Sunday at 4 o'clock. So we're delighted with that. And thank you very much for listening. We're also making the move to move all the podcasts over to YouTube as well, so that you have another platform, yet another reach to be able to listen to the show. And we would really welcome the support for Radio Corkabashkin in County Kilkee, which is the radio station and the show that's keeping you in the loop.